All right, happy to welcome to the show today John Ganz. He's the author of the book When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John Ganz, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Great to talk with you. Tell us about the title. Where does When the Clock Broke, where does that come from?
Well, this comes from a speech that Murray Rothbard, the libertarian economist, gave in 1992, early 1992, to the John Randolph Club. The John Randolph Club was a kind of synthesis of libertarians and paleoconservatives, an organization they were trying to, have anchor their movement. And he gave this speech on the occasion that they were doing an event for Pat Buchanan, who had just kicked off his primary campaign against George H.W. Bush. And Rothbard gave this real barn burner and included this line, we will break the clock of the New Deal. We will break the clock of social democracy. We will repeal the 20th century. So the image to me was great, and I wanted to keep it. The other thing about it, the metaphor, the image really seemed to work because, when I was researching this time period, it seems so much like we were stuck in a lot of the same issues. So the image of a clock being broken or the lack of time progressing just really seemed to fit with the topic really well. So
did the whole idea of the end of history, does that also play into this metaphor?
I was just about to say, yeah, exactly. Like, Francis Fukuyama's End of History essay comes out in 1989. His book comes out in 1992. And this is basically a little bit of a twist on the end of history. It's not so much that history ends in this triumphant liberal democracy is the only game in town, really. I mean, obviously Fukuyama's a little more nuanced than that, as your listeners will know. But yeah, it was a kind of more downbeat, minor key version of the end of history as a metaphor.
I also noticed in the subtitle, it says America cracked up in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
And I think this is an important distinction. So I graduated high school in 1992. I graduated college, obviously. Well, it should have been 4 years later, but in the late 1990s. And I mean, I can tell you, by the late 1990s, things seem to be pretty good. Now, maybe it could be that we tend to think when we're young, and especially when you're at a certain age, you're in college, you're free, and it seems like everything's great. But to me, the late 1990s seemed pretty awesome. And indeed, you could look at, there are statistics that would buttress this. Is this specific to the early 90s?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the 90s are remembered as a decade of peace and prosperity, for good reason. The country seemed to be doing really well. I think in the early part of the decade, though, you get a glimpse of something else, a different country altogether, which kind of returned with greater fury later. You had nothing like 2008, but a financial crisis and recession that showed the fruits of what deregulated finance might do. You had the results of deindustrialization, collapse of middle class jobs, and then you had a lot of anger at the political system, sort of as a result of all that. A lot of rejection of the political establishment. So you could see like the shape of where things might go. And then yes, there was a period of prosperity. I would argue somewhat superficial, or the fixes were not permanent. And then a lot of the same issues reemerged. So there's kind of a structural argument going on here that there was a structural underpinning to the political crises that we seem to be facing now, and since 2015 certainly. Were there. They kind of went into latent or repose or remission, but have reemerged with greater fury.
Yeah. And I think, so far the kind of unspoken elephant in the room, right, is this thesis, and correct me if I'm wrong, but generally that Donald Trump and MAGA and the current kind of at least right-wing political paradigm, that the seeds for that were planted during the early 1990s. And figures such as David Duke, Ross Perot, and Pat Buchanan would be three of probably the prime examples.
Yeah, I mean, those figures represent in different ways, but in related ways, a revolution from the right, that was against the establishment of the mainstream, and to a certain degree against the establishment of the conservative movement, against the U.S. political establishment in general, or so they frame themselves. But from a distinctly reactionary or right wing point of view, sometimes this would manifest itself into certain ideas about race. In the case of David Duke and Pat Buchanan, certain ideas about American nationality, where immigration, trade, where how America should comport itself to other countries in the world. Ross Perot's appeal is more purely populist and anti-establishmentarian. There are some racially coded parts of it, but obviously does not lean into that in the way that Buchanan or Duke does. But yeah, these are a variety of sort of right-wing populist rejections of American political establishment, liberalism, and then the section of the American right that they felt had accommodated itself to American liberalism too much. And that really comes back with a great fury with Trump and sort of the people on the right who saw Trump. I mean, Trump is a phenomenon, like Ross Perot, a phenomenon that attracts lots of different people, sometimes people who don't have strong ideological preferences, may have not been that interested in politics before, but his message appeals to them. But then many people on the right and in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement view Trump as, okay, finally a guy is speaking our language, is rejecting the parts of the Republican Party and movement that we find frustrating and want to get rid of. But that dissent, that current of dissent, I would argue, first crystallizes with Buchanan.
Let me ask you this. Do you believe that Donald Trump kind of masterminded this and like specifically looked and said, I'll take a little Newt Gingrich here, I'll take a little Rudy Giuliani there, I'm going to take some David Duke here, with Pat Buchanan, and that he sort of masterminded this? Or do you think that like that was just the water in which he swam and his cunning kind of unconsciously crafted this persona?
It's a good question and a difficult one to fully answer. So I will say this. I mean, Trump obviously has a kind of intuitive way of relating to the political world that does him good and does him bad. I will say, I mean, when I was on Ezra Klein show, they turned something up that I was embarrassed not to have found, actually, which was Donald Trump on Larry King in 1992, commenting specifically on Pat Buchanan and David Duke and saying, remarking on the potency of the anger behind their political movements, and said that he thought they would get a lot of votes. Trump is obviously aware, in his kind of start-stop efforts to start a political career previous to 2015. He was floating around the Reform Party. He knows who Pat Buchanan is. He's criticized him very strongly for what his politics were. Called him a Hitler lover. Yeah. Apparently, I've heard that he actually apologized to Pat Buchanan shortly before he launched his campaign in 2015, which is remarkable because this is not a man who apologizes to many people. I think that he is aware. Okay, he's aware of the third party world of American politics. He knows this approach, and he sort of takes the third party tack and uses that as a strategy to take over the Republican Party. And the other thing is, another part of his political lineage is the Tea Party, which is an anti-establishmentarian faction of the GOP, which really kind of attacks and goes after rhinos and mainstream Republicans, and is really racialized. He gets into politics using the birther stuff. So you kind of have to say he knows this world well. Whether or not he's able to articulate it in the way that like a Pat Buchanan column can, it's very much a language that he's heard. He's familiar with it. A lot of his advisors come out of this culture. So I don't know, and he name checks Pat Buchanan in speeches from time to time. Says Pat Buchanan's a very smart guy. Yeah, I think we have to say, I mean, Trump always seems to be kind of stream of consciousness, but I do believe he's more aware of this kind of subculture of American politics than you might think. You know, I think he's been swimming in these waters for, as you put it, swimming in these waters for a while. He is not, he's ideologically flexible, so I don't think he would never say, I'm a paleo conservative, I'm exactly like Pat Buchanan. He's very focused on being his own sui generis thing. But yeah, he's in his own way very aware of this current, I would say.
So again, I mean, this is like the perfect book for me and the perfect era. I'm a child of the 80s. I mean, Ronald Reagan is a very formative for me. I'm a huge Reagan fan generally, although, you know, like everybody, there's pros and cons.
Right.
And I like that sunny, optimistic form, that Reagan style. And it just seemed to me that, you know, you would have people like Pat Buchanan rise up and they would be beaten down. And Ross Perot, he does get 19% of the vote, but his ideas get co-opted into the political parties. And David Duke, you know, he does get elected, I think, to the Louisiana State House, but the establishment rallies and you know, stops him. And it just seemed like that was what was going to happen, that the Republican Party had cranks, just like every movement has cranks and fringe elements, but we could keep them out.
Yeah.
And then Trump defies that. I mean, I don't know if that's because he's a celebrity, if it's because he's funny, or if it's because the internet had come around and changed things, or what. Do you have a theory on why he was able to succeed?
I think it's a real collection of things. I think it's, as we Marxists like to say, it's overdetermined. I think that, first of all, one can't discount the fact that, yes, he's an entertainer. He's a person from showbiz. That gives him an exposure and a certain number of skills that makes him different from other politicians. You have to have that. The country's also in a very different place. You know, this is a post-2008 United States. This is a highly deindustrialized United States. The warnings that people like Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan gave about things like NAFTA and, you know, and immigration, arguably, the demographics of the country look a lot different. It looks a lot more like the country that they were warning about. So his message resonates a lot more with people. The crisis, if you will, has gotten a lot deeper. The menu of policy solutions that was sort of dominant from, say, 1980 until you know, not very long ago, maybe even Biden, or, you know, partially under Trump, I would say, seemed more and more discredited, right? So the neoliberal era, if you want to put it like that, was sort of ending. Just kind of relying on the market, creating new free trade agreements, so on and so forth. These didn't seem to be solving problems anymore. They seemed to be making them deeper. And there was more openness to, you know, maybe a big revision of American economic policy that put, you know, to coin a phrase, America first a little bit more. So, yeah, I think that the conditions changed. I think as a candidate, he has certain talents, experiences, skills, exposure that's a lot different from any of these guys. He crosses over into a world for people who are not that familiar with politics. I mean, Pat Buchanan is a creature of politics. Someone, as a political junkie, watching cable, reading newspapers, you would be aware of Pat Buchanan. Ross Perot, you know, is a figure who has some pop culture cachet, but not a celebrity exactly the same way that Trump is. So yeah, he plugs into celebrity culture, he plugs into tabloid culture. So yeah, I think when you combine all these different features of both what was going on objectively in the country and what he brought to the table as a candidate, it was sort of a perfect storm that allowed him to, you know, launch this political career that rose quite quickly.
And of course, one big thing that helps explain this is just the collapse or the end of the Cold War. And I really do think that the Cold War was a glue that kept the right together. It gave them a common enemy.
Yeah.
It made isolationism seem absurd.
Right.
And that so many of the right's problems could actually just be the inevitable outgrowth of like that coming to an end.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is in miniature also what's happening on the right is happening in the paper. What is going on in the country as a whole. You have kind of the focus, the way the country was organized ideologically, right? You know, we have one foreign opponent, and that kind of, you know, makes the debate, the parameters of the debate domestically kind of limited. But it also had like real material effects, like, you know, a lot of our economy was geared towards defense production, and then you have a collapse around the same time of both, you know, the system of defense production and the ideological focus on the Soviet Union, and this kind of unmoors a lot of the country, and it's unclear what the basis of our entire national direction is going to be behind that, both as an ideological program, both as like what's going to anchor us productively. And, you know, basically the idea was, well, we don't, maybe, you know, we're a wealthy country now, we're more of a consumer country, we can focus on services, other people can do our manufacturing for us, and, you know, we'll get nice manufactured goods for cheap prices. This has led to its own problems, and what do we do about where we orient ourselves in terms of the world? I mean, this is very complicated. We've tried to replace the Soviet Union with other foreign rivals, other kind of ventures abroad or notions of civilizational opponents. None of them have really taken. You know, they're just not doing the trick. And some people, this part of the right, I mean, they have an international agenda. Obviously, they have certain beliefs about China. They have certain beliefs about, you know, how the U.S. should perhaps not be so engaged in Europe, not, you know, Atlanticist to the degree that older conservatives or Republicans were. But their real focus is on domestic enmity, in my opinion, that there is a cultural Cold War, which Buchanan kind of kicked off. He said, well, you know, we won the Cold War abroad, but there was a kind of fifth column here of libs, kind of undermining the traditional basis of civilization. So that culture war as Cold War is a one way this could be taken, but the problem is that it's not. That is the opposite of unifying, right? This creates a constant tension and constant political struggle within. You know, it's not saying, oh well, we need to bring it together to do this thing, either to, you know, make a new deal and rebuild our economy, or to defeat or fight back a foreign opponent. It's very focused on this internal struggle. It's unifying for one party, one faction of that party, but not for the nation. By its nature, it's divisive of the nation as a whole.
So as I noted earlier, I mean, I was like, you know, a young conservative in the 1980s and in the 1990s, and I really believed all Reagan's speeches, you know, like including being a shining city on a hill and being welcoming of immigrants and that kind of thing. He didn't call it compassionate conservatism, but it was like an optimistic, sunny conservatism.
Right.
And, you know, there were always cranks and racists, but I figured it was a pretty small percent. And I do wonder, was Donald Trump in the inevitable outcome of the seeds that were planted in the 90s? Or say, like, if Colin Powell runs in 96 and wins, or if Al Gore wins in 2000, or if Mitt Romney wins in 2012, is there an alternate history where things would have been more Reagan-esque? Or do you think that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had to be a party for this America First right-wing movement that went dormant post-World War II?
I think that's part of it. What we also did not discuss is Iraq. You know, the failure of American foreign policy in Iraq makes this faction of the right look a lot more prescient, because they always had a critique of interventionism abroad, which was kind of dismissed. as a fringe position, but then after the catastrophe in Iraq, that seems sort of more reasonable. I think that basically, structurally speaking, the suite of policy proposals that the free market Republicans, the Reagan Republicans, had to deal with every given issue in the United States was just going to stop working. Like that arrangement had certain effects on the economy that buoyed the U.S. economy, I think, at the detriment of a great deal of Americans, but for a certain part, sort of did the trick. It got us out of stagflation. It seemed to be an engine to drive U.S. prosperity to a certain extent, or at least drive the prosperity of certain aspects of capital that, we're grateful for it. I think after 2008, essentially, that stops. That essentially, we wonder how much that's really working. It comes to its crisis period, and then we start to see, a return to earlier ideas of how to, Keynesianism makes a big comeback. People start talking about social democracy again. All of a sudden, you have a socialist movement in the United States. So I think it was like the arrangement, the effort to reorganize the economy on the basis of favoring the interests of capital, in that specific way, was no longer yielding, was cached, was no longer yielding the moderate prosperity it could offer to middle Americans. So I think it was inevitable that there was going to be policy shifts. And it makes sense that the Republicans go back to their kind of McKinleyite roots and talk about protecting American industry and trade. And it makes sense that, the Democrats kind of go back to their roots and New Deal roots and start talking about, more social democratic, welfarist system. So, I think both parties eventually, the neoliberal era, I know it's a really overused term, but for the lack of a better one, was going to kind of come to an end, and both parties were going to have to reconfigure their sets of policies. I just think that, Romney-Ryan Republicanism, basically the reason why Trump triumphs is it has no constituency. Its constituency is among the elites. No one else wants to cut Medicare. No one else wants to cut Social Security. These are nuttier programs in a way than stuff that Trump comes up with. So I think that just was going to eventually run out of steam. And even figure, I think, let's say there's a return to Republican normality, quote unquote, with a Youngkin or something. They're not going to just go be free traders, laissez-faire capitalists in the same way that Republicans were for many years.
Don't you think, though, in defense of Romney-Ryan establishmentarianism, if you believe that these entitlements are running out of money, then it's certainly not populism, and it's not popular to want to do like means testing, for example, but it might be good leadership. And I do think in the olden days, political leaders who were gatekeepers, they had more ability to get the public to buy in on ideas that might require sacrifice. Whereas I think it's probably harder in today's world to get the public to embrace an idea that might cost them something.
Well, the last politician I can remember off the top of my head who tried to convince the American people that sacrifice was important was Jimmy Carter, and we all know what happened to him. So yes. I'm afraid trying to sell people on austerity is a hard sell. I mean, and I think it's especially a hard sell if your party seems to be in tight with a lot of people who seem to be doing quite well, and seems to be working in their interest, and then you tell the vast majority of the American people a lot of the things that you took for granted and grew up with and your parents had, you might not get. I mean, it fundamentally doesn't seem fair. So whatever changes we need to make in the economy, from my perspective, they should come not at the expense of, a person who expects that they're going to get Social Security like their parents and grandparents did before. Perhaps the people who, in whatever policy regime we've set up, have managed to do quite well. I think, since the 1980s, the United States economy and policy regime has been set up to assist the rich get richer, and they've done very well for themselves. That had some productive results too. I'm not going to deny it. We were at the forefront of technology. Our country was extremely powerful and prosperous, continues to be extremely powerful and prosperous. I'm not saying it has no productive reasoning behind it. But its productive reasoning seems to be a little less now that these rich people are no longer creating the personal computer, but crypto scams and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? Like I am sympathetic to the bourgeoisie so long as they're productive. But once they become parasitic upon the rest of the country, then I would say maybe we should shift. It's like layoffs. You have workers and you say, well, we thank you for your service, but you're not being very productive anymore. And I just think there's sections of capital who are kind of just trying to line their own pockets, aren't being particularly productive. Silicon Valley likes to flatter itself as being, we are creating the engines of the future. I think we have a right as a country to ask ourselves how much that's really true anymore, and to take to look under the hood. And not to just assume that these people always are going to come up with some brilliant new product. Maybe they're just collecting rents and kind of protecting their own social position.
So I want to ask you about specifically within the Republican Party in recent years prior to Trump. It seems to me that most of kind of the populist nationalists were people like Pat Buchanan, who I think, aside from being a populist nationalist, was a devout Catholic and talked about his faith and social conservatism. Rick Santorum, similarly a devout Catholic. Mike Huckabee, I think a Baptist preacher. And they tended not to do so well. And then comes kind of this vulgarian Donald Trump, and he obviously is able to completely take over the Republican Party. Is that a coincidence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think that Trump obviously needs to keep a coalition together that includes religious people, but I do believe that one of the insights of some of certain populist nationalists more in Trump's vein. Buchanan was friendly to the Christian right, but I think that he was actually, weirdly enough, in many ways, his policy ideas and his philosophy prefigures a more secular turn in the Republican Party than, say, the rule of Pat Robertson's and Jerry Falwell's. I think he's a little different. He recognized them as part of their coalition, but he thinks in civilizational terms, which can be easily secularized or racialized. I think that that's a good point. There are many people who are conservative leaning or have nationalist sentiments or populist sentiments who are not particularly religious and may be turned off by the religious right or find it to be a little silly or embarrassing. Trump realizes that. The common sense that Trump tries to generate or speak to it goes beyond religion. It includes religious people. But I think what the insight of somebody like, say, a figure in my book, like, say, Sam Francis, who was trying to kind of theorize this nationalist right before it came to fruition with Trump, would say religious conservatives are certain species of people trying to protect their cultural identity. Religion is a means to an end in that way, not an end in itself. And I think you can see that clearly when you have religious people who are very much willing to compromise on on their ethical system when they have a political leader who's willing to sort of attack their enemies and seems like a friend to their general cultural process. I think a lot of religious people view themselves as a culture, a community that has a certain shape. I wouldn't question their faith necessarily, but that's the way they relate to their religious life. And if someone seems to break the literal message about morality, it's less important than them that they share a political approach that they find to be germane to their interests. And in that way, they're like any other constituency. But yeah, I think it needed to expand beyond the Christian right to a more secular or more a big tent about people with generally kind of right-leaning or conservative values, and Trump definitely does that. I mean, but on the other hand, Trump has a religious appeal. I mean, it's perverse, but a lot of people kind of view him as a religiously inspired figure. I don't know if that's
Definitely.
backfilling, but he has a providential character, almost a messiah to some people. So it's complicated, but yeah, I take your point that this is a more secular right than you would expect. Under George W. Bush, who was made a big story of himself being born again, and HW also not very convincingly, trying to play himself up as kind of Texan and not as this kind of blue-blooded Connecticut Episcopalian wasp. But yeah, I think there's an appeal to a part of the country that doesn't feel particularly religious, for sure.
So in the early 90s, obviously Bill Clinton gets elected president in 1992. I always looked at the Clintons as being, corrupt. Bill Clinton had all these bimbo eruptions and affairs, and there was like cattle futures and all. There was some shady stuff going on. But on the right, there was also really big conspiracies, like they killed Vince Foster and all of this stuff. I have to confess that although I didn't buy into all of that, I saw it as fairly harmless and kind of fun to a certain degree. And yet now when I look at where we've gotten to, it strikes me that may have been the beginning. Those conspiracies may have been the beginning of some weird stuff that has really even further metastasized and brought us to maybe like the QAnon and some of the conspiracy theories of today.
Yeah, I mean, look, conspiracy theories and paranoia are part of the American political tradition. They're very old. They're not new. It's very difficult to pinpoint when they emerged, but it's definitely true that they've become more of a mainstream part of political culture in our lifetime. They fire people's imagination who might not otherwise understand or be that interested in politics because they present things in very dramatic and lurid terms. They provide kind of mythical representations of American political truths. Let's say, like, what is birtherism? Obviously, it's not really about whether or not he, in fact, had a birth certificate, right? It's some kind of message that has something to do with the Americanness or not of Obama, right? That's what it's really about. What is the stolen election thing? Do they really believe? Is it really about they really think the election was stolen? No, it's about we don't really think that the other side are real Americans. These are mythical representations of, what you think the country ought to look like and who you think ought to be in control. And they're powerful, and they transmit those things in emotional images, not in propositions that educated people might like to trade in, but for most people they think in images, and they respond to powerful myths. So I think conspiracy theories speak to that level, and they're an important part of mobilizing constituencies who don't have a policy agenda necessarily. They respond more to appeals like that. On the other hand, again, like everything Trump does, they limit they make it hard for him with people who are not inclined to think that way and find that sort of stuff frightening. And they limit his appeal. Ultimately, though, that can't be it. That doesn't extend the possibility of, getting. Trump is always going to lose as long as he relies on this kind of mythic image of like elites conspiratorially doing things against middle Americans and sort of preying on them. it's not going to appeal to like old Republicans, suburban white people who are professionals, maybe to business owners and to kind of car dealership types stuff like that. But like, I think he's going to have a hard time winning over professional white people, college educated white people, black people, and all minorities who might otherwise, be willing to listen to a kind of conservative appeal, but they don't like precisely the language it's being put in. So, a lot of the things that he does to get a mass following also cuts him off from other parts of, other parts of the United States and other coalitions that he could use to generate a really hegemonic coalition. Trump has never been able to. He's never gotten majority support, right? He's sort of a weird. He gets his band behind him and he kind of crashes through the gates. He's not creating a massive majority coalition that could change the terms of politics. Like, Reagan gets elected and then everyone says, or FDR, and says, well, they're in charge now and we kind of have to adjust ourselves to what they say and kind of become a version of that. That's real power, is when a party, a victorious party, changes the other party through the fact that they're dominant, right? Trump hasn't done that. In fact, the Democrats have moved leftwards in a lot of ways. He hasn't made them, we need to become more like the Republicans, like Reagan turned the Democratic Party in. So
it's the whole sun and the moon party. We've got two moon parties, and I think that's part of the problem. Right.
He's not creating a hegemonic coalition. He has a different attack, a different tactic, a different strategy, which it's not interested in trying to say, we're going to change the terms of U.S. politics. It's just like, we're going to win and hit the other guys over the heads. It's not like we're going to persuade the entire country that we have the way to go forward. And if anyone wants to do politics in this town, they're going to have to take some part of our program. And that's real power in democracy, is changing the terms of the debate. Trump doesn't change the terms of the debate. And that's the other thing people like, I often say Trump is a fascist. I have no problem saying that, or there's some analogy between that. And people say, but he's so weak. He's not popular. And I was like, yeah, exactly. The reason why he has to do this sort of thing is that he doesn't have the opportunity, he doesn't have the skills, he doesn't have the infrastructure to create a truly dominant electoral coalition. All of the appeals to these demagogic tactics, all of the employment of the mob in the street, and when he's tried to do it, are ways of making up for those deficits. His weakness is precisely what makes him, an authoritarian figure. So I think that those are totally compatible approaches. In fact, they're necessarily entwined. He emerges in a situation in which the political establishment is in kind of a crisis. He tries to take advantage of that crisis. He tries to jam his way in, and play the elites off each other. But ultimately, he doesn't have if he had great masses behind him, he wouldn't need to have done January 6th. He would have won the election. It's that simple. If he was strong, he would win. But he needs to do these creepy, weird things to make up for the deficits for his real political deficits. Yeah.
And so far, we've been mostly focused kind of on personalities. But I do want to ask, the 1990s had a bunch of weird events. You've got Columbine. You've got Oklahoma City. You've got Ruby Ridge.
Yes.
Are these simply examples to prove that the 90s maybe weren't as great as we tend to kind of lionize them and remember? Or do these help tell the story as well about how the 1990s kind of led us to where we are today?
Well, I think, events like these events, Ruby Ridge, Waco, the Oklahoma City bombing, they were shocking events, traumatic events for the country, tragedies, as they're often called. Their political meaning was not always well understood, that they represented the appearance of a certain constituency, of a certain form of politics in the United States that maybe needed to represent itself through violence or through these kinds of specific tactics. But actually, were also, constituencies, I wouldn't say mass, but had some popular significance that politicians felt like they needed to speak to. Trump launches his campaign in Waco. Trump is the first candidate in a long time in the Republican Party who excites that section of American politics. So I think that this was a group, a dissident part of American politics. Pat Buchanan said the greatest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. These groups to the right of Ronald Reagan, which we all once dismissed as fringe or as kind of insignificant in the story of American politics, I think turned out to be a lot more important than one thought. So I thought it was important to go back to these events and think about them not in terms of these are weirdos in a freak show of American society. Actually, like what is the political meaning of these things? What do these movements mean? Why did they resort to violence as a political tactic? Did that help them? Was that a form of propaganda for them that was successful? So I think it's important to kind of do this archaeology of these events that at the time we understood to be important, but maybe we didn't fully get the significance of. Yeah.
And we've just scratched the surface, but it's fascinating discussion, and of course, right in my wheelhouse. How can people obviously go get the book When the Clock Broke? How can people read your other writings, follow you on Twitter, all that good stuff?
Well, I'm on maybe a permanent break from Twitter post-book, but my Substack newsletter is called Unpopular Front, and you can find it at unpopularfront.news. Try to write a couple newsletters a week about all this kind of stuff, mostly focusing on the right, some focus on Silicon Valley, especially with their right-wing turn, but, general reflections on politics and culture. I write sometimes for magazines and newspapers, so you can find me there. My byline appears from time to time. But yeah, check out the book. You can find it at pretty much any bookstore, Kindle or Audible book if that's more your thing. But yeah.
All right, get the book. John Ganz, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was great.